Hi, I'm Femi Okay.
I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, 3 segments from Libya. We will look at the battle for Tripoli, share ideas for ending the country's war, and hear about migrants caught in the country's conflict.
As always, you can take part in our conversation. Send us your thoughts via Twitter or in our live YouTube chat.
Why are detained migrants being killed in Libya? Questions still surround the July the 3rd air attack near Tripoli that destroyed a migrant detention centre and killed at least 50 detainees and wounded 130 others. A UN special envoy to Libya said that the attack could constitute a war crime. The incident is believed to be one of the most fatal cases of civilian deaths since April, when rebel forces led by General Khalifa Haftar launched a military offensive to seize the capital city. Have a listen to what UNHCR spokesperson Charlie Yaxley had to say about the attack on migrants.
This was a despicable tragedy that never should have happened. We warned about the situation of the detainees in Tajura just 2 months ago. We called for them to be evacuated after a similar airstrike badly damaged the roof of the centre and injured 2 of the detainees. Sadly, they were not evacuated, and 50 of the detainees have paid the price with their lives. What we need now is a significant shift in approach. The clashes continue, and there remain some 3,800 people in detention centres at risk of being caught up in the violence. We need enhanced search and rescue capacity and renewed efforts to make sure that no refugee is returned to Libya. It cannot be considered to have a safe port at this time, and the tragic events of the last week have shown that.
But with us to talk about this from Tunis, Sam Turner. He heads the Libya mission for Doctors Without Borders, or MSF. In Istanbul, Abdulkader Assad, a senior writer with the Libya Observer. And in Rome, Italy, Claudia Gazzini, a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group. Welcome to the stream, all of you. I want to start with our community and someone in particular who says they're in Tajura. So this is Ndoka native, and the people behind this account say they're the official page of refugees in Libya in suffering. Ndoka native writes, the migrants in Tajura's shelter where they were bombed by an airstrike, sharing this picture with us. Today they got out of Tajura because the UNHCR is unable to save or evacuate them. And still many are waiting for evacuation and assistance. And of course we heard what the UNHCR spokesperson had to say at the beginning of this show. But Sam, what do we know about this attack?
What we know is quite simply that it represents an atrocious attack on civilians, no matter who they are. But in this case, it was civilians who were trapped, who were locked into a detention facility, leading to such an extraordinary and immediate loss of life of, we believe, up to 60 people who were killed in this attack on the detention center. Where migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers were being held. And coming 2 months after a similar strike on the same detention center compound that was referenced by Charlie from UNHCR. I was actually in Tajura Detention Center the day after that previous strike. And I went into that cell where the shrapnel had torn through the roof and a huge piece of metal had bounced off the ground just a meter away from where a baby was sleeping on a mattress. And the women were terrified. And I can only imagine that level of fear and desperation now felt by all those refugees, migrants, who continue to be trapped in detention centers in Libya and for whom there are really no options.
Abdulkader, do you want to explain why, where this detention center is, it would become a target?
Actually, there's no explanation why it would be a target, but the only explanation that I can say is let me say the madness of the attack and the attackers, because shortly before, 1 day before the attack, Haftar's forces and his spokesman, they said we're going to be carrying out precision airstrikes on targets in Tripoli. And the day after the airstrike hit the migrant center, and the day after the migrant center was hit by airstrike, the spokesman Ahmed Mismari said that we did it. We carried out the airstrike on Ad-Daman camp, which is another name for the detention center. And he said this was like an absolute confession and admission of the attack, but there was no action or no condemnation. And you know that the UN Security Council failed to condemn the attack because of the US, rejection, and then they condemned the attack, but they didn't condemn the people who carried out the attack. So this is actually a failure on many levels, and that's why it's happening. It's happening to civilians, Libyans, or the migrants. Both of them are civilians. But the tragedy here is that because these are civilians who are trapped and have nowhere to go. They are forced to be in that place. They can't run away. They can't go freely around the area. That's the only thing.
I think there's
the whole
a
issue
need
is
for a little
actually,
bit more of context.
Go ahead, Claudia. Give us the context from your perspective.
I think we need a little bit more of context because we have to place this attack within an ongoing war that is happening since the beginning of April between forces of the Libyan National Army headed by Haftar against the forces of the Tripoli-based and UN-backed government. And it's since April that we've been seeing daily airstrikes on Tripoli and on various parts of Tripoli, mainly targeting military installations or allegedly buildings and infrastructure believed to be under the control of military factions from the opposing side. Now, this attack on the Jazeera detention center, according to the LNA, was a mistake. They claim they were attacking a weapons depot of an armed group in the nearby area. It is a fact that there is an armed group based in a plot of land neighboring the Jazeera detention center. And the previous air attack that my colleagues were referring to, the one that happened 2 months ago, did appear to have targeted one of these depots of weapons.
Claudia, I'm just going to interject with LNA, the Libyan National Army. We also have community wanting to be in part of this conversation as well. So hold tight. We'll just come back to you in just a moment. Malika, go ahead.
Claudia, on your point about this being part of an ongoing war, and so, of course, much of this started with the advance towards Tripoli by Khalifa Haftar. I wanted to share the viewpoint from a journalist, Sally Hayden, who makes that same point and says this is not unique in itself, and this is part of a chain of other things that we've seen. So have a listen to what Sally told the stream.
The number of deaths in Jazeera is only the latest in a line of deaths in Libyan detention centres this year. In Jazeera, witnesses told me that 2 refugees who tried to escape at the end of June were shot and killed by guards. And from what I've seen, there's no responsibility for any of these deaths. I've asked the EU, the UN, Libyan authorities. Nobody's adding up the number of people dying in detention. And also, there doesn't really seem to be much of an attempt to tell the families of the people who die.
So, Sam, do you want to take that on? Because she says there seems to be a lack of responsibility claims on either side.
Absolutely, and Sally is completely right to bring up the situation in other detention centres, not only in conflict-related deaths, where we have seen a horrific attack on Qasr bin Gashir in late April, where an armed group stormed a detention center where over 800 people were being held. We know that in that incident, several people were killed and up to 20 others injured. But these deaths in detention centers are not just confined to armed conflict, and we have seen numerous deaths in detention centers from preventable causes. Due to the lack of provision of medical services and the extremely poor conditions of detention themselves. I mean, as we currently stand, and the war in Tripoli has had a horrendous effect on all of the civilians who are living in Tripoli and the surrounding areas. But the WHO, the World Health Organization figures suggest that they can confirm around 106 civilian deaths since the start of this conflict. Now, we know for certain that around 60 of those deaths are amongst refugees and migrants in detention centers. this conflict is having a disproportionate impact on this population.
And yet it's all just part of a much bigger picture, as Claudia hinted at earlier. So I want to push on just a little bit to the battle for Tripoli. More than 1,000 people have been killed since April as two rival coalitions fight for control over the capital city. Libya has been in conflict since the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. And currently the country has two rival governments. In Tripoli, a UN-recognized government of national accord, which receives support from Turkey and Qatar. And in Libya's east, rogue commander Khalifa Haftar and his self-declared Libyan National Army. They've been advancing on Tripoli with a ground and air offensive backed by the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Abuses have allegedly been committed by both sides. Well, the World Health Organization said on Tuesday that 106 civilians have been killed in the fighting. So have a listen to General Khalid al-Mahjoub. He's the operations spokesman for the self-declared Libyan National Army.
The instructions issued by the commander-in-chief of our forces are not to target any governmental, private, or public institutions. These institutions belong to citizens or belong to the state. They cannot be targeted because we care about it. We are a responsible army and disciplined force which cares about the interest of the country.
So Abdul Qadir, you heard what he had to say there, but I want to share what this means for many members of our audience in Libya. This is Noha, who says this war penetrates into everyone's life, no matter how much we resist succumbing to its formidability. She goes on to say, where I live is not considered close to the heavy fighting, but they make sure to remind me of the war every now and then by those loud rumbles and booms. The sound of sirens never fails to make your heart cringe as you realize that your fellow Libyans are losing their lives for no good reason. The smell of death is sordid. The tolls keep getting higher as the stakes do too. What has this conflict and this push towards Libya, towards Tripoli rather, Abdul Qadir, meant for your average resident?
Actually, the residents are directly impacted by this, fighting because water cuts, power cuts, and everything. But let's talk about the displacement in the first place. This fighting since April 4th has displaced so far over 100,000 people and more, of course. And these people are spread around Tripoli, the capital, and other western region cities. Now, this displacement means a lot because these families have nowhere to go. Most of them went to the schools. So the education or the study system has stopped because of the families being hosted in the schools. Other issues are related to the hospitals, the medical staff, and the lack of services because of the big number of injuries and the idea that most of the medical facilities are in fighting zones. Let's talk about the infrastructure and the properties, the private and public properties that have been targeted by Khalifa Haftar's forces and airstrikes. We have books, stores. We have, of course, school books for the government have been targeted. We have many private properties that have been destroyed. If you look at footage from Ain Zara, for example, Gasabangish here, from Khalid Farjan, you can see total destruction of private properties. These are things that cannot be regained so easily. People have worked their lifetime in order to build a house and build a small shop to sell things to the people. So these are humanitarian issues, and these are very simple things that are not caught by everybody's eyes.
Claudia, if I asked you just to sum up General Haftar, what would you say about him?
Well, General Haftar divides Libya. There are Libyans who feel that he is the hero that saved them in Benghazi from radical groups that had put the city in hostage. And there are many Libyans that have a completely opposite view and see him as the incarnation of evil because he used the label of the war against terror to wage a war against opponents. And these individuals essentially consider him a man who's only after power. It's not up to me to define him, but I do recognize that he's a divisive figure in Libya, and unfortunately, to reconcile Libya, to bring back together this country that since 2014 is divided in two political entities, two rival governments and military coalitions, there needs probably to be Libyans need to find a middle ground, not only on what Khalifa Haftar is and what's he doing, but on many other issues that have divided and continue to divide the country. And to go back to your question about what is the impact of this war in Tripoli. My colleague before mentioned sort of the humanitarian impact of the war, but I think there's a much more important sort of political long-term impact of this war, because up until 4 months ago, there was still some hope of a reconciliation through peace talks, through UN-led mediation. But since the outburst of hostilities in April, that has all vanished, really. The two sides of the conflict, so the armed groups that are supporting the Tripoli-based government and the armed forces that are supporting the Libyan National Army coalition headed by Haftar, are both sort of being drawn into what they perceive as an existential war, where almost only one winner can can be left standing. And I think this is the biggest tragedy of the war, that the parties of the conflict are locked into a zero-sum game that makes us think that the conflict will last.
Community also want to weigh in on this point. So, on to our final segment. Solutions. Can there be such a thing to the war in Libya? After 8 years of conflict, why has it been so difficult to end the country's war? Fighting in Tripoli has forced the postponement of some peace efforts. Despite this, Tripoli-based Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj last month proposed a Libyan Congress, and that's aimed at finding a peaceful solution to the conflict. Here's what he said on June 16th.
We've decided during this forum what will be the future roadmap of this period and create the suitable constitutional law to hold presidential and parliamentary elections before the end of 2019.
A political solution. What are the possibilities of that? Abdul Qadir, what do you know about negotiations that are going on? Are there negotiations for negotiations to take place even?
Actually, negotiations have stopped the moment Haftar led the offensive on Tripoli. You know the story, but one thing is important here. Haftar is advocating for military rule in Libya, so there is no negotiation or political solution on his agenda. He's talking about bringing back the family rule, not the military rule, not the dictatorship alone. No, the family rule. He likes the Gaddafi rule, where his sons can take part of the governing of the country, and we can see that very clearly now. His sons, 2 or 3, are in the military, and the other one is just doing education and entertainment stuff in Benghazi. So this is absolutely a mentality that does not help Libyans. Libyans want a modern state, a civilian state where they can go and vote and choose their parliament and their president. This was very close to happening before the attack of Tripoli that was led by Haftar. So the idea that, as Siraj said, that we need a new method for negotiation is absolutely helpful, because you cannot negotiate with someone who really led a coup against negotiation. Again, we need the new faces that represent the eastern region, western region, and the southern region. So we need the new people, new political figures to lead negotiation, Libyan negotiation under the UN efforts. But
I think that's somewhat wishful thinking. That's somewhat wishful thinking, in the sense that I take note of Siraj's ambition to have a new forum in Libya that can bring on board new voices from the East. But we have to face the fact that, willingly or unwillingly, Haftar, his forces, and the government that backs him are a reality on the ground. You might like them or not like them, you might condemn them or agree with them, but it's difficult to propose a political process that excludes an actor that has the military might to attack Tripoli and has the level of foreign support that he has. So somehow I think we need to be thinking about a new form of political dialogue and negotiation, but certainly not one which a priori excludes a force on the ground. Unless the force is, of course,
I think one thing that is explicitly clear in the situation in Libya is that while governments around the world put their own national interests first and perpetuate the current situation in terms of the military support that is being provided to both sides in the conflict, or be it the policies of European states where the priority appears to be more about controlling migration than supporting Libyans to see a peaceful and successful Libya. I think until we see a change in that situation, we're going to continue to see the ongoing conflict that has racked the country for years.
I wanted to share the viewpoint of one of our community members from outside of Libya, but who's looking at this, as so many of our community members are, as to what international players can be doing. So this is Adilike, and here's what he told the stream.
The situation in Libya is really pathetic, given the power plays that are involved. The power plays have their own personal interests in this conflict. By and large, everybody wants to agitate their own personal interest in the Libya situation. After the death of Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan is exposed to any form of control by external forces. They have opened their wings to external forces to actually have a take in their governance. The Libyan citizens need to take their destiny into their hands. They need to realize that they should put their country first before anything. Khalifa Haftar and the GNA needs to hold a peace deal, wherein there will be a ceasefire and that will put an end to the ongoing conflict.
So he mentions external forces there. He's not the only one. This person tweeted, in my opinion, the war's end is not in Haftar or GNA's hands. There are too many external forces at play. Claudia, what do you make of that point?
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that the conflict in Libya is a multi-tiered conflict. On the one level, we have the international component of the conflict, and in fact, they are regional actors. They are playing out their own turf wars on Libyan soil. As you mentioned earlier, there is a coalition, an axis that goes from Cairo to the UAE to Saudi Arabia that have a common vision for the region and see the Haftar as their ally, and on the other side, Turkey and Qatar. So this is the international dimension of the conflict. But then we have also locally different layers. We have a political conflict, we have a military conflict between rival military coalitions, and we have a conflict over the control of the country's finances and economic resources. So the long-term solution of the conflict in Libya requires an intervention on all three levels. There needs to be a convergence of the international actors to pressure their proxies or their friends in Libya to accept a ceasefire and accept reconciliation talks, stop arming them, stop violating the arms embargo, but also at a domestic level there needs to be political talks. There needs to be military to military, if you want, a dialogue about security in Tripoli, but nationwide.
Claudia,
and also
it sounds like you've got a whole framework, a whole plan. Are you talking to anybody in Libya right now? You sound like you've got the entire plan just put out there, because this has been this whole entire conflict has been going on for 8 years. Abdul Qadir, Sam, Claudia, thank you so much for your insight into the three different topics that we were looking at, all surrounding Libya over the last couple of months and also years. Malika.
I end with poetic words from Noha, who is a poet. She wrote the metaphor of war, and this part really caught our attention. Buildings fragment, they crumble. Two armies in my city rumble, halting our lives while fighting for theirs. And the Libyan social fabric tears. Thank you for that, Noha.
We had so many community comments about what's going on in Libya, so this conversation will continue online. Luke and I you'll find us at ajstream on Twitter. Until the next time, we'll see you online. Thanks for watching.